Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Honeybee Research and Extension Lab at the University of Florida. My name is Savannah Gardner, and I will be your host today on the electronic field trip. And here with me are two scientists. We have Dr. Jamie Ellis and Dr. Cameron Jack. And on our team here, we have graduate students in the Department of Agricultural Education and Communication. We have Caroline behind the camera, Alice behind the camera, Rachel will be taking questions today, and our lovely director, Emily. Now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jamie Ellis to introduce himself.
Hello, my name is Jamie Ellis. I'm a professor here in the Entomology and Nematology Department, and specifically, of course, I work in the Honeybee Research and Extension Laboratory.
Hello, my name is Cameron Jack. I'm also a professor here in the Entomology and Nematology Department. I have primarily a teaching appointment, and I also do research on honeybee health.
Awesome. Thank you both for being here. So in our first segment today, we would like to know where you are all tuning in from. So go ahead and drop that in the chat so we can give you a shout out, and feel free to drop questions along the way. In our first segment, we're going to give an overview about the research lab here, as well as what are pollinators, what are honeybees, and why should we care. So we're going to keep Dr. Jamie Ellis with us for this first segment. If you want to tell us a little bit more about the lab and what you do here.
Sure. So the Honeybee Research and Extension Laboratory, as the name implies, is the laboratory where we do research, extension, and instruction on honeybees. Now, we have a physical facility. We are standing right now in the research laboratory where all of that type of work is done. But we also have responsibilities in extension where we take what we do as scientists and take that information to the general public. We also do teaching here, which Dr. Cameron Jack's going to talk about a lot more. So we're composed of undergraduate students, graduate students, volunteers, postdocs, technicians, a lot of folks who kind of collectively make up the honeybee team here at UF.
Absolutely. That's awesome. So you mentioned pollinators and bees. So what exactly is a pollinator?
Yeah, so I'm going to, broaden the scope of what we're talking about. We are a honeybee lab, and we work with honeybees. But honeybees are only one of many different types of pollinator. And as the name implies, a pollinator is a living organism that moves pollen. So we work with bees, and of course bees are pollinators. We'll talk a lot more about that here in today's segment. But other things can be pollinators as well. A lot of other insects, butterflies, moths, ants, flies, beetles. But other things too, bats, birds, mammals, especially small mammals. So lots of things will visit flowers, move that pollen around, and result in the pollination, which of course in turn ensures that we have all of these flowering trees and shrubs.
Absolutely. That's awesome. So how do you manage those honeybees here?
Yeah, so here at UF, we work specifically with honeybees in the lab that Dr. Jack and I co-manage. And in this lab, we have honeybee colonies. We have to have bee colonies in order to do the work that we do. So right outside the lab, we'll make sure and show you guys this at some point here in the segment, but right outside the lab, we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 or so colonies. We also have a number of colonies scattered around research apiaries around here in north central Florida. And we have someone who works in our laboratory, a beekeeper in our laboratory, whose job it is to manage the colonies and keep them ready for the research projects, the extension projects, and the teaching that we do using honeybees.
Wow, that's so interesting. So how did you get into honeybee research?
Yeah, so there's actually an easy answer to that question. When I was 8 years old, I got interested in bees, but I couldn't talk my parents into getting me colonies because beekeeping's not in my family. So it took me about 4 years to convince my parents that I was serious, and around age 12, I got my first honeybee colony. So since I was kind of that weird kid in school who kept bees, my science teachers, both in middle school and in high school, gravitated towards me, said, Jamie, you like science, you like bees, why don't you do science fair projects related to bees?
Yeah.
And so I did science fair projects related to honeybees throughout my years as a student. I also did 4-H projects related to honeybees. And by the time I got to work on my undergraduate degree, I was working in a honeybee lab. I was loving honeybee research. I put it all together, and here I am today, fortunate to be working at the University of Florida, specifically in this laboratory.
Wow, that's so great that it all started with the science fair project.
It really did, yep.
Yeah, that's a great way to get involved in science. So sometimes we think of bees and beekeeping, and it sounds kind of scary. So how do beekeepers stay safe from bees, and should we be scared of them?
Yes. My guess is a lot of you guys out there have heard that honeybees sting. Maybe even some of you have been stung by honeybees. Honeybees, generally speaking, get lumped into a big group of organisms that sting. That would be bees, wasps, ants, etc. Well, beekeepers and scientists alike work with honeybees knowing that honeybees are capable of stinging. In fact, I've been stung since age 12 tens of thousands of times.
Wow.
Now, the way a beekeeper would try to mitigate that is they would do things like wear bee suits. Here we have an example bee suit that will protect your entire body, your arms, your legs from stings. Also, this particular suit has a veil that zips around the head. You can even, when you work bees, wear special gloves that go over the sleeves, your hands, and over the sleeves of the bee suit to protect your hands. So when you're wearing a bee suit and a veil and gloves, you're nearly fully protected. But over time, as people get more and more comfortable working colonies, they tend to migrate away from the suits and just wear veils. And so when I work bees, I make sure that my head and neck is protected with a veil, similar to the one on the suit. But otherwise, I'll just wear, pants and roll-up long-sleeve shirts. I know a lot of people who keep bees in shorts and a T-shirt. I even know folks who don't use veils. But in general, I highly recommend that if you work with bees, that you wear personal protective equipment, at least a veil. And that's what a lot of beekeepers do to protect themselves from stings.
Wow, that's so awesome. Thank you so much for showing that. So why are beekeepers important in our state specifically and in our country?
So beekeepers are important because they have to manage honeybee colonies, which then, of course, begs the question, why are honeybees important? Well, honeybees are important. When people think of honeybees, they think honey because it's in the name, right? Honey, bees, so they think about honey. Well, in this particular case, honeybees, of course, make honey. Maybe you guys out there actually eat honey. Maybe it's something you really like to consume.
Yeah.
But honeybees are important for another reason, and that's because they consume pollen. Bees will actually fly to flowers, collect pollen, bring it back to their hives, and they use that pollen to make more bees. So you asked why are beekeepers important? Well, they're important because they have to ensure that these colonies are actively managed and healthy and capable of performing the pollination service. So growers out there, for example, here in Florida, growers of blueberries and cantaloupes and squash and watermelon, etc., they will pay beekeepers to put their colonies on those crops while those crops are in bloom, and so their bees can pollinate those crops, which in turn get the growers more and better fruits, vegetables, nuts, berries. So beekeepers then have to make sure colonies are strong and healthy so they can provide the pollination services that agriculture so desperately needs.
Wow, that's amazing. So basically all of our food is because of pollinators. We wouldn't have the food that we have today, the produce, because of bees.
Yeah, and so I always kind of teach it this way. If you're out there, you can really maybe appreciate this. If you think about the standard McDonald's cheeseburger, kind of from north to south, you've got bun, you've got ketchup, mustard, pickle, onions, cheese, meat, bun, right?
Yep.
So if I were to snap my fingers and make honeybees go away, you'd still have the upper bun, because buns, bread, it's from grains, and grains are wind pollinated. But ketchup and mustard came from plants that had to be pollinated by bees. Onions came from a plant that had to be pollinated by bees. Pickles came from cucumbers, a plant that had to be pollinated by bees. And people will say, well, what about the cheese and the meat? Well, bees are used to pollinate clover and alfalfa, which cattle eat.
Yeah.
So even cheese and meat would be compromised on the standard McDonald's cheeseburger. So you'd have bun, a little bit of cheese and meat, and bun. And that's what honeybees and other pollinators do for us. They take something like a little bit of meat and a little bit of bun and make it something like buns, ketchup, mustard, pickles, onions, all of the stuff that we appreciate.
Yeah, those are some of my favorite things to eat. So thank you to the honeybees. All right, we're going to go ahead and take some questions right now as we are coming towards the end of segment 1. So we're going to switch on over to Rachel over here to see if we have any questions.
Yeah, one of our first questions up is, what do honeybees eat and drink?
What do honeybees eat and drink? Well, they collect pollen and consume it, right, to turn it into more bees. We know that honeybees also eat honey. Now, honey is not really bee food. It is bee fuel. So honey is the energy that moves a bee. And bees do collect water, but they don't collect water for drinking. They collect water so they can sprinkle droplets of that water around the nest, fan their wings at the nest entrance, and use it to cool the nest temperature.
Oh, that's really cool. So how warm is it in the beehive?
It's a great question. Individual honeybees are cold-blooded, so their temperature is the environmental temperature. But when you put a bunch of honeybees together and produce a colony, colonies actually thermoregulate. They can keep the temperature in the nest somewhere around 94 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 34 or so degrees Celsius, and they keep it that temperature regardless of how cold it is or how hot it is outside. So they can thermoregulate. The colony is warm-blooded.
Do honeybees have any predators?
They do. Honeybees do have predators. Of course, humans are one of the chief predators, right? We work with them to take their honey, but bears obviously come to mind. Probably all of you out there have seen stories of Winnie the Pooh, right, going and collecting honey. Well, it's never that gentle when a bear goes to a honeybee colony. So we have bears as natural predators here in North America. Places like Africa, they have things like honey badgers, and there's birds in the Middle East, honey eaters that will go into honeybee colonies. So yeah, there's a lot of predators that will attack honeybee colonies.
Very cool. This lab looks really new and fancy. So how long has this lab been here?
Yeah, so we moved into this laboratory in July of 2018, and it is a brand new facility, right? We still think 3 years is brand new. And it's probably the largest single standing honeybee laboratory probably in all of the U.S. There's over 16,000 square foot of space in the buildings associated with the honeybee laboratory here at the University of Florida.
Awesome. Orlando Colonial FFA would like to know if you can explain a little bit more about the difference between bee fuel and bee food.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So food, right, is what we use to grow, right, and nourish us. So really, because honeybees are insects, they do not grow as adults. So pollen is used to grow that bee, and then honey as an adult is used to fuel that bee.
Awesome. And our last question comes from Ms. Peterson's class. Julia and Anne Marie want to know, how many bee colonies do you have and how many bees are in a colony?
Yeah, so here at the University of Florida, we typically manage somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 to 250 colonies, and each colony can be composed of up to 40 to 50,000 individual bees. So I want someone out there to do the math. 50,000 bees times 250 colonies. How many bees do we have? For sure.
That's a great question. If you can come up with that number, put it in the chat. Maybe we'll have a special shout out or prize for you. All right, here we are at segment 2, back with Dr. Jack. So how did you get into entomology, Dr. Jack?
Yeah, it's interesting. So entomology is one of those things where most people don't grow up thinking like, I'm going to study bugs. You know, like it's something that usually you find later on in college. And so for me, you know, I grew up around honeybees and beekeeping. My grandpa was a beekeeper.
Wow.
So I mean, it was just something that I kind of knew of, but it was, when I was a kid, it was like the weird thing that my family did, not something that I was like super excited about. But then once I got into college, I took just one entomology class, and I just thought it was enough to be like, you know what, this is really cool, this is interesting. And I knew that I wanted to pursue something in science, but I think up until that point, I don't know if I had ever even realized that you could be a scientist and not just be in the medical field. I thought, like, if you wanted science, you were in the medical field. But there's a whole other world of research and interesting things, and so I just got into honeybees again, and then I learned that I really liked studying this organism and insects in general.
Absolutely, that's amazing. Such a good explanation of science. So you mentioned research. What kind of research are you doing in this beautiful new lab that you have?
Sure, so as we've already mentioned, this is the Honeybee Research and Extension Laboratory, right? So we are specifically researching honeybees, but there are so many different aspects of honeybees that we can research. So primarily, one of our focuses is to learn about how to control honeybee pests and diseases. There are lots of things that are plaguing our honeybees.
Wow.
So for instance, there is a parasitic mite that is called Varroa destructor.
Okay.
And this mite will feed on the fat bodies and the blood of the bees, and it will transmit a lot of viruses. And so it's really these viruses that make honeybee colonies really sick. And so
Okay.
really Varroa is public enemy number one. So a lot of our research is focused on controlling this mite through chemical control, through non-chemical control, through breeding bees that are more hygienic. We also will, another major honeybee pest is the small hive beetle. So this
Wow.
beetle is a big problem for beekeepers because they can get into the honeybee colony. It'll lay a lot of eggs. The larva will hatch and start consuming everything inside the
Wow.
hive. It can be just a really tough pest for beekeepers as
Absolutely.
well. So a lot of what we do is we will. Let me show you some example here. So here's a bunch, like a Tupperware full of beetles that we might use to rear our own beetles, so we can do studies.
Wow.
And kind of see, which chemicals might kill the beetle. But when we're doing research, we always have to be extra careful because especially if we're talking about finding a new chemical or something that we would put into a honeybee colony to control honeybee pests, then it can be really tricky because we're trying to control, an arthropod that's on another arthropod. So,
Right.
so they're related enough that it gets really tricky. So we do a lot of experiments where we might have bees like in a cup where we might be able to put a chemical on them and kind of see how toxic it is to the bees, and then compare that with either the Varroa or the small hive beetle or any other pest or pathogen that we might be researching.
Wow, absolutely. So what are those bees eating in there?
Okay, good question. So you see how in this particular cage how we've got they've got 2 syringes here. They're filled with liquid. We know that bees they want nectar to
Yeah.
survive, right? That Dr. Ellis talked about how that's the fuel of the honeybee. So they've got basically a sugar syrup that
Okay.
we're making an artificial nectar for them that they can have the fuel to stay alive. We also put a little bit of pollen in there to give them some food to grow and develop normal, and that might be important for depending on what kind of test that we're doing.
Absolutely, that's awesome. So I see lots of impressive equipment in here. So what equipment do you have in here? What do you use regularly?
Yeah, I mean, as a lab, we do have a lot of pieces of equipment. There's a lot of, when you're doing science, there's going to be specialized tools that you're going to need
Right.
to solve certain problems. So one of them, just a classic example of microscopes. I mean, you'll see that we actually have probably a dozen or so microscopes throughout our lab because we have lots of students and things coming in and helping us with research. So at its most simple form, a compound microscope is probably the bread and butter. That's what we really need, the most common tool that we're using in the lab. But so, for instance, this type of a microscope is a little bit fancier where we can, where it comes with a screen instead of just the eyepiece that we have to work. But what's really nice is with this type of a microscope is so that we can point to things. So here we're looking at a honeybee wing. So you can see there's veins in the honeybee wing. We might be able to tell things about this bee just by looking at how the venation is patterned in
Absolutely.
this wing. So there's things like, so this microscope, of course, is something that's really important. We also have different like fume hoods or laboratory spaces that are just for handling chemicals that might be particularly toxic. We don't want to breathe in those chemicals, and that it might help us keep a more sterile lab space, because depending on what we're doing as well, we don't want to introduce any kind of foreign bacteria or even foreign DNA into the sample, so we need to keep things nice and sterile. So we have different rooms throughout this laboratory where we can kind of keep things segregated to specific tasks, just so that we can keep a really clean and working lab space.
Absolutely, yeah. This is a very impressive lab here. Lots of different functions I see with all this equipment. So you do this research, you get these findings. How do you share that with beekeepers to then benefit their hives?
Yeah, that's actually a really, really important question because really science, what's the point of doing a bunch of scientific research if you're not going to share it, right? This is, science communication is essential part of doing science. And so there are a number of different ways that we can share our research. The very first thing that we're going to do as scientists is when we do an experiment, we have to write it up. You just have to write. And so for all of you out there that are not paying attention in English class, I'm telling you, you need to learn how to write well, okay? Because, I mean, that was not something that I thought. I kind of blew it off. I'm like, no, I'm going to do science. I don't need to write, right?
Right.
But you do. I mean, you will probably, no matter what career you choose later on, you just need to know how to communicate effectively. So writing is really important because then we can share our research with other scientists, but then we can also write it in a way where we can share our research with the public. Maybe that's so it's not so technical. And then an important part of what we do, of how we share our research, is by going out to beekeeping organizations, to beekeeping groups, and showing them, demonstrating how to do certain things that might be improve their beekeeping, or maybe different things that they could change based on our research. So it's about, being face to face, but also writing really well.
Absolutely. No, that's a great explanation of extension. So you mentioned at the beginning that you do research, extension, and teaching, and that's most of your appointments. So what are some of the classes that you teach at the University of Florida?
Sure. Yeah, I actually teach a lot of courses. Right now we offer about 9 different courses related to honeybees, beekeeping.
Wow.
And so every semester I'm teaching 3 to 4 courses, and it gives students the opportunity to interact with honeybees. Some of them are online, some of them are in person. The in-person courses, I will give my students some, woodenware. They have to build their own hive.
Wow.
Then I give them a box of bees and say, keep these bees alive. And we do different tasks, extracting honey, and they can taste it. So there's some hands-on physical things. There's a lot of reading about honeybees, kind of understand the basic biology and theory. But a lot of the courses, we have some courses that Dr. Ellis and I teach together that are not really necessarily just about honeybees. It's about how to do research and how to conduct scientific experiments. And then we have courses that are about insects in general, more about how to use chemicals to control insects and what they do physiologically to the insects. So we just teach a wide range, even a study abroad course to Thailand. If you want to go experience different kinds of bee species throughout the world, I mean, we got an opportunity for that. So lots of different kinds of courses. If you could, there's a little plug for UF. You can come to UF and study anything you want to.
Wow.
Really, I mean, there's so much to know.
That's amazing. You mentioned so many amazing opportunities. So if you do come to the University of Florida, maybe you could take one of Dr. Jack's classes.
You definitely should.
As an elective or something. That would be awesome. So what is your favorite part of conducting this research and working with students every day?
This might sound cheesy, because maybe it is a little bit, but I really think my favorite part of being a researcher and an instructor is actually seeing the growth that takes place in the students and in the beekeepers, to see the change that they might be able to take place that can improve what they're doing. So for students, we as an undergraduate student, you've got the whole world in front of you, right? There's so much to learn and to do and to see and to experience. And for most people, they have not experienced honeybees before or research. So being able to introduce them to that is just really exciting to me.
Wow, that's amazing. So if students are listening right now and want to get involved in science, how could they do that at their school?
You can get involved in science just by looking for science fair opportunities, reaching out to working with your instructors, your teachers, asking for opportunities to do that, meeting with people in your neighborhood, looking for problems that need to be solved. I mean, the world is full of problems that need to be solved, and it's this generation that's going to be the people to do it. So get involved in science early on and stay with it, and I promise it'll be a rewarding career.
Absolutely. That's great advice from Dr. Jack. We're going to go ahead and take some questions right over here with Rachel.
Awesome. I'll start with a simple question. How many people work at your lab?
Yeah, that's a great question because you'd think that I'd be able to answer that right off the bat, but I don't actually know. There are, a group of about 3 or 4 of us that are consistently in the lab, that are kind of the lab leaders. But then we have maybe a dozen or so of other, we have students, we have postdocs, we have visiting scientists that will come in and out. And then we have dozens of undergraduate students that come and help with this, within this lab. So within a year, we can sometimes have 40 to 50 undergraduate students that will come in at some point and help us do research. So
That's-
lots of people in the lab.
That's awesome. Now, a tougher question from Ella. Do you ever use electroantenograms?
Wow, well, that's an awesome question, Ella. So sometimes we do. So now an electroantennogram would be where you're basically hooking an electrode to an insect antenna, and then by blowing certain like pheromones or chemicals across the antenna, you could see basically the reception, the activity that's going on with that antenna. So the reason that might be important is, what if we were trying to find a chemical that was an attractant to a specific organism or a repellent of a specific honeybee pest? We could do some of those things with that kind of device. We don't own one, but we work with with science. You work with a lot of different people, and so we collaborate together. And so we have colleagues that do have that type of equipment where we can collaborate on projects.
That's really cool. So another question from Henry is, are there bees in a forest, or are they only found when they're managed?
Great question. So just to make a quick distinction, Henry, so there are lots of bees, right? As Dr. Ellis mentioned, honeybees are just one type of bee. There are so many bees. So there are lots of bees everywhere, and definitely in forests. Now, honeybees, you can have feral honeybees where they were managed, and then they might swarm, so half of the colony might leave, and they might go end up in a forest and stay there for years, and that's so you can definitely see that. Because of all the pest pressures, the problems that honeybees are facing, oftentimes many of these feral colonies don't survive for more than a few years. But they still can, and you still can find honeybees just out in the wild. But typically they don't last for too long.
Very interesting. Orlando Colonial wants to know, what exactly is beeswax and where does it come from?
Yeah, great question. So what exactly is beeswax? Well, this is something that the bees are secreting from their abdomen. They have glands underneath their abdomen that will allow them, they're just called wax glands because that's where it's secreted from. And then this is, you've all seen wax and handled it. It's how it's kind of a semi-firm piece of something. That's a great question. I don't know exactly how to define wax. You just kind of have to feel it to know what it is. But it allows the bees to, basically, they can make their own home with this, and it serves so many purposes. We could get really into the weeds about all the different functions of wax inside of a hive, but it does give them kind of structure for them to raise their young, to store their honey and their pollen.
All right, our last question for this segment is a really interesting one that I've never thought about from Ms. Peterson's class, is why are bees black and yellow?
Good question, Miss Peterson's class. So, not all honeybees are super white, black and yellow. I mean, some of them, they kind of can change their shading kind of based on their region. Some bees tend to be much more darker than others. And so honeybees can have some variability there. The short answer is I don't necessarily know. I think it's probably evolutionarily over time. There must have been some function, but I don't know. Good question, Ms. Peterson's class.
Ms. Peterson's class, maybe that's something that you could look into for a science fair project. See if there's anything out there and answer that question.
All right, thank you, Rachel, and thank you all for the great questions. Keep them coming. So for our next segment, we're actually going to go on a little field trip outside to the bee yard, where we're going to see some of the live honeybees in the backyard. So follow along as we walk through the Honeybee Research and Extension Lab. So, Dr. Ellis, as we're walking through here, what are some of these posters we see on the wall and some of these paintings?
Yeah, so just a point that I'll make about laboratories is, not only are they a place to do science, but they're also a place that the scientists have to work, right? So we have a lot of office space, et cetera. But one of the things that I want to point out is our lab is a pretty place to work. For example, on my right here, there's a lot of research posters highlighting some of our research. As I kind of slowly back down the hall, these are a lot of manuscripts that we produced about research. One of the things that Dr. Jack mentioned is you can't just do research. It actually has to be published and accessible to the public. So this is a poster board highlighting some of that. We also have on the wall a lot of art that has been donated to us because people knew we were building a new bee lab and they got excited about that and donated a lot of really nice paintings, pictures, etc. that we can use.
Wow, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing a little bit about that. What is this picture right here?
Yeah, so we have a lot of paintings. This one painting is showing that there's a lot of bee colonies in the background waiting to be loaded on barges and taken out to a specific area in the Florida swamps to make Tupelo honey. And
Wow.
you'll see a lot of very beekeeper-themed paintings as we walk down the halls of this building. And incidentally, we have an entire virtual tour that people can go to our website and see. So if people are interested in knowing more about how our lab looks and how it's set up, they can go online to our website and see some of that information.
Wow, that's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. So here we are in the bee yard. You want to start by telling us a little bit about the plants that we might see here and what are on these little boxes all around us?
Be very happy to tell you. So all of you guys out there have been watching us talk about research while we're in a research lab, but you have heard us say over and over and over that we work with honeybees. Well, here's the honeybees.
Wow.
We have some colonies over to my left. All of these white boxes represent the home of a single colony. There could be up to 50,000 bees in each of those boxes, and all of these represent colonies that we use for research purposes.
Wow, that's amazing. So now that we know a little bit about pollinators in this lab here, what are some things that students can do to maybe help the bees? We've probably all heard a little bit about save the bees or the bee populations are declining. So
Yeah.
what are some things we can do?
Well, one of the things I like to tell students is just right out the gate, some of you are probably interested in keeping bees, so you can consider becoming a beekeeper. Now, before you run out and do that, beekeeping is a bit of work. So you have to get with your parents, your guardians to make sure that they'll support this. But if you're interested in keeping bees, you can do that. You can also do what we did here. You can landscape with pollinator-friendly plants, plants that pollinators can benefit from using. You can become educated about bees, beekeeping, pollinators, which will make you better stewards of pollination well in the future. And you can do really simple things. We don't have one set up here, but a lot of bees, not honeybees specifically, but a lot of bees like to nest in cavities. So folks will take pieces of untreated wood, drill holes of various sizes in it, and simply leave those blocks of wood scattered around their backyard to give nesting sites for a lot of these types of bees. Again, it would not attract a honeybee nest, which is good, but instead would attract a lot of these solitary bees that you can have safely around in your backyard.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Absolutely.
I'll be sure to go home and build a little home for some honeybees myself.
Good.
Dr. Jack, is there anything you want to add about the garden out here?
Well, so, if you're a honeybee, imagine you're a honeybee and you're flying over a neighborhood where everybody has like a perfectly manicured lawn and it's mowed down to perfection and it looks nice green grass. Well, guess what? If you're a bee, that doesn't look like much to you, right? That's just makes you hungry. There's nothing there. There's nothing there for you to eat. So, as Dr. Ellis mentioned, having good plants around that provide some nectar and maybe provide some good pollen resources is going to be really important. You know, you might even be able to convince your parent to, if they're telling you to go out and mow the lawn, you could even maybe make that argument and say, actually, we should let some weeds grow in our lawn just to see how that goes. They might not be okay with that, but just giving the bees more forage is probably one of the simplest things that you could do.
Absolutely. That's great advice right there. So what is something we should all know about honeybees?
Something that we should all know about honeybees. Well, one of them is just that we should know that honeybees are actually really important. They are what we call a super pollinator. I mean,
Wow.
just and in the insect world, I mean, you could make an argument that honeybees are the most important insect for our food systems because they pollinate so much of the food that we eat. So, yeah, you know, I guess something to keep in mind is that you don't need to be a beekeeper. Some people are just not going to be into that, and they're not going to care for it. But I would want you to understand the importance of them so that you can even be an informed citizen later on in your life when decisions need to be made about managing for pollinators. You can know the importance of them and help be good stewards.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So I'm going to go back to Dr. Ellis here. You mentioned pollinator-friendly plants. What are some of those that we could plant here in Florida or
Yeah.
even around the world? I know we have a global audience today.
So that's an important question. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you some basic ground rules for choosing pollinator-friendly plants. Number one,
All right.
you want to use native plants. And the reason I'll say native plants is because plants that are native to an area are likely to establish and grow best in the area where you live. You obviously wouldn't want to plant something necessarily we have here up in Washington State if it's not going to grow there. So there are lots of specialists around the country, especially in county extension offices. There's expertise that can tell you what native plants can be used to put out in your garden and provide good forage for bees. Now in Florida specifically, some of the things that we like to do are the native hollies or red maple or some of the wild plums that we have or cabbage palm. A lot of what you see around here are things that are native. Dune flowers, sunflowers, we've got saw palmetto, gallberry, lots of things that you would find in this stretch of Florida that really benefit honeybees. So think native, think pollen providers, and think nectar providers, and you've done a lot to really help out pollinators in general.
Absolutely. That's amazing. So do your research and plant some
That's
native
right.
plants. I love that. So I'm going to ask you both one more question, and then we're going to get to your questions before we end for the day. So share a fun fact about bees. What is your favorite fun fact?
Well, I'm going to share the fact that I shared in a class earlier today, which is, honeybees collect nectar from flowers. They literally fly to these flowers. They use their tongue to suck up that nectar. They have a special organ in their body that they use to carry that nectar back to the hive. When they get it to the hive, they spit that stuff out into those wax cells, and then they'll evaporate the moisture off and turn it into honey. So to make a long story short, a lot of folks know that nectar, or specifically honey is bee vomit. So that's my favorite one.
Wow.
Cameron?
All right, so I think my favorite bee fact has to do to when I think about the honeybee colony together as kind of like a superorganism. So the idea of a superorganism is you have lots of organisms. I mean, you got individual bees that they are themselves an organism, but then collectively together they function as like their own separate animal. So the honeybee colony is what we call the superorganism. And the superorganism functions like other organisms. So for instance, even the bees need to bring oxygen into the colony. So they're fanning their wings in, they're fanning their wings out, moving air in and out. So if you look and measure the amount of oxygen that's coming in and the CO2 that's coming out, it's actually happening at about the same rate as a dog or a cat. So it's like honeybees are like they could be like a pet, basically.
Oh,
They're
there we
functioning
go.
like a pet.
I love that. That's awesome. All right. We're going to end it out here with some questions from you. Back to Rachel.
Hey, a question from Ms. Peterson's class is when we were looking at the microscope, it looked like there was hair on the bee's wing. Are there hairs?
Good question. So There are actually some hairs, some seeded that will that are used kind of a sensory, but maybe what you were seeing in that photo, something called hamuli. These are, it's kind of like Velcro, actually. The image that we were looking at was at a hind wing, but bees actually have 4 wings. Every time you see a picture of a bee, you only see 2 wings, but they have 4. So they have a forewing, which is in front, and then a hind wing in back. To help the bees fly stronger and faster, they will hook their forewing and their hind wing together with those kind of looking hair, like those little hooks that are called hamuli. So I think that might have been what you were seeing on the image.
That's really awesome. Another question from Ms. Peterson's class. They have a lot of really good questions.
Good job, Miss Peterson's class.
Is how many bees are born every week in a colony?
Well, that's actually answerable. So good job, Ms. Peterson's class, but I'll take my best shot at it. So during peak egg production season, a queen is laying somewhere in the neighborhood of around 2,000 eggs a day, right? So that would translate to about 14,000 bees a week. It
Wow.
takes 21 days for a worker bee to go from egg to adult. So if she lays 14,000 eggs this week, 2.5, 3 weeks from now, there'll be 14,000 new adult bees born in that nest.
That's a lot of bees.
It is indeed.
Will would like to know, why do honeybees swarm?
Cameron, you want to take that one?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So you remember how I was just talking about the superorganism, how a colony or an individual bee is an organism, but then when you have a whole colony of bees, then it kind of functions itself as an organism. So if you're thinking about reproduction, the reproduction in a honeybee world is not just a queen laying these thousands of eggs every day, right? Reproduction is actually one colony becoming 2 colonies. So they do this through a process of swarming, where the old queen will take about half of the bees and they will leave the nest and go find a new location to live. And that's swarming. So when you see a bunch of bees actually leave and they go and they will hang in the nest and they will look for a new location to find. And so now that is colony level reproduction.
Ella wants to know if honeybees ever compete with native bees over food sources.
They, in fact, do. So one of the things that's inherent in the question that Ella asked is this idea that honeybees aren't native, right? Because do they compete with native bees? And in reality, that's important because honeybees are not native to North America. The honeybees that we have here were derived from importation starting at about the 1620s. When European settlers came to North America, they brought honeybees with them. And of course, in North America, there's somewhere in the neighborhood of about 4,500 bee species, one of which is the honeybee. That means there's 4,499 or so other bee species out there that are trying to use the same resources that honeybees are using. So there's been a lot of research looking at honeybee and native bee interactions to get right at the heart of that question. And in some studies, in certain circumstances, they found competition. In other studies, in other circumstances, they saw no negative impacts of honeybees at all. So it's important to remember, generally speaking, the majority of honeybees are kept in agricultural settings. So in many of our wild and natural communities, honeybees don't play a significant role in competition with native bees.
Very cool. And for our last question, I know that y'all study honeybees, but do you ever find native bees or have other bees around the property?
Yeah, so I'll take the first stab at that. We absolutely do. Here in the state of Florida, we have about 320-ish species of bees. Again, one of those is the honeybee. So here in Gainesville, where the University of Florida is based, we'll see lots of different bee species. Other parts of the country have even more, specifically in the southwestern United States. There's lots and lots of species of bees. And so one of the things that I'll encourage you guys to do is go out and look at flowers and see what pollinators in general, but what bees specifically you have on your property.
Wow, thank you very much for that. I want to give a special thank you to all of you today who tuned in to watch and to our scientists. Thank you and have a great day.